Hello again, class. Back for our video review of the reading and writing about literature pages for today. I want to start by picking up where we left off with the Writing Logically, Thinking Critically lecture from earlier, and this idea of metaphor, right? When you use a metaphor, it's a figure of speech that helps understand one thing in terms of another, right? So think about the poem, Because I Could Not Stop for Death. He kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality, right? That's the first stanza. She's not saying that the speaker, right, actually stood on the corner waiting for death to pick her up in a carriage, right? It's a metaphorical description as just, right, I could not stop for death, right? Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. So what she's saying is that we don't get to really pick when we get picked up by death, right? Just like you'd like wait at a bus stop for a bus to come or wait on a corner for an Uber to pick you up, right? So imagine if death wasn't in the carriage, death was in an Uber, right? Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The Uber held but ourselves in immortality, right? So it's just this metaphorical idea. And when we use metaphors, we try to describe one thing in terms of another. Now, if that description has the word like or as, it's a simile, right? So a metaphor is when you make a comparison without the words like or as. Writing is therapy. Writing is therapeutic, right? That's a metaphor. You're comparing writing to a therapy session. If you say writing is like therapy, well, now you're creating a simile. Now you're suggesting with the word like or as the comparison, and that's why we call it a simile. We'll consistently point out metaphors and similes throughout the semester, specifically when we're looking at the Shakespeare readings, specifically when we're looking at the poems and the literature selections throughout the semester. Now, the essay in Writing Logically, Thinking Critically that you read, Poetry for Everyday Life, had all those different metaphors, specifically ones about money metaphors, health metaphors, food metaphors, object metaphors, agent metaphors, and I thought he made a good point. How we use metaphors all the time in everyday life without even realizing it. Whenever anybody says someone is, down in the dumps, was one of the examples. I hear that a lot. I hear that all the time. Or someone's riding high. One of my favorite metaphors that you'll hear me use a lot throughout the semester is that something's easily digestible. I feel as though the readings in these books are all easily digestible. Writing logically, thinking critically. They've got the words in bold that are important. They clearly explain them, they define them. They put the definitions at the end of each chapter again. Reading and writing about literature, the important words, again, are in boldface. They define them, they give examples. They're very clear on how you should read literature actively and write about it. And I think in the first reading for class day 2, they did a nice job of discussing and presenting the idea of reading actively and then annotating Because I Could Not Stop for Death, the poem, um, to demonstrate that. It's one thing for somebody to tell you how to do something, but it's another when they actually show you and explain it. And that is why for your reading review quizzes, whenever you come across a bold-faced word in either of these books, right, I will ask you to define it and to give an example to prove that you understand what that word or idea or concept means. Because you don't understand something until you can explain it to someone else, whether it's how to cook a recipe, how to change a tire, right? You have to be able to explain it with details and descriptions. So I like the idea how they introduce you on page 1 to reading and writing about literature. Why do we read literature? Why do we write about literature? Well, I thought the book made a really good point. When we read literature, we learn about life, right? And we learn about how to make decisions because that's why we read. And part of reading the Shakespearean tragedies this semester in a critical thinking class, right? Why is that important? Well, they're tragedies, and the characters make illogical decisions, and tragedy results. So hopefully we can learn how the characters could have avoided those illogical decisions by using critical thinking skills. And then we can in turn use those same critical thinking skills in the decisions making process in our own lives. So when we read literature on page 2, as it says, why read literature? We learn about life. We learn about what the book calls the human experience. Again, we learn about life. We learn about the human experience. You can bet there's going to be a lot of literature in which people write about their experience during the stay-at-home order, during their experience with COVID-19, um, their experiences, right, at protests, their experiences, right, in dealing with a lot of the political and social situations that are currently a part of our culture. So when we read literature, we learn about life. When we write about literature, as it says on page 3, we're learning about ourselves and sharing ideas about our own selves and our own lives, our own human experience. So, whenever we say the human experience, as the book refers to it often, we mean life. And again, the point is to make logical decisions, to be happy, to be healthy, to hopefully be financially sound and financially responsible. And a lot of times when people make bad decisions, myself included, people make illogical decisions, myself included, characters in the Shakespeare plays make illogical decisions. We can better understand how those decisions could have been avoided or amended, right? By recognizing helpful, logical, critical thinking skills. So, um, as we're moving forward, the role of good reading, reading critically, reading actively, this idea of the myth of hidden meaning. Again, it's just that it's a myth, right? Whenever we interpret literature, you always want to ground that interpretation in facts, in words, in examples, in ideas present in the literature, whether it's a story, a poem, or a play, right? To help support your interpretation of that literature, your analysis of that literature, your thinking critically about that literature. On pages 8 and 9, very clear details on annotating. Um, by reading your discussions, by reading your reading review quizzes, I think everybody understands the importance of annotating. I think everybody recognizes how to annotate. The book gives great examples on pages 8 and 9. And then as we get to page 10, now we actually have an annotated poem, right? Before we get to the poem, because I could not stop for death, I just kind of want to skip ahead. Obviously, right, pages 12 and 13 talk about journaling, talking about using reference materials, um, ways to help you gather information, um, discussions, things of that nature. I think a lot of this is self-explanatory and familiar. The key is before we analyze the poem, recognize on pages 14, 15, and 16, and I don't expect you to see them through the camera, but just so you know, I have the book on my lap as we're going over this because I want to make sure I specifically direct you to the pages as I'm doing the lectures, just as I would do if we were in the classroom. There's questions for active reading, whether it's a story, right? A poem, or a play. Questions for reading fiction, for reading poetry, and for reading drama. And whenever you're going to analyze literature, use the questions on pages 14, 15, and 16 to help you generate ideas for analysis, to help you generate ideas for active reading. Think of these questions, right, as pre-writing strategies. So if you're going to write about a story, use the questions on page 14. If you're going to write about a poem, use the questions on 15. If you're going to write about a play, use the questions on 16. And you'll notice that the questions on page 15 when analyzing a poem are all applied in some ways, right, to the analysis of Because I Could Not Stop for Death and the annotations on page 10. Now, our last video lecture, we discussed the idea of worldview, and I kind of touched on the idea of Hamlet and his worldview with regard to Gertrude and Claudius's decision to get married so soon. The idea of grief, of death, of getting over it. They're all themes in the reading so far. This poem also deals with the idea of death. And the speaker's worldview on death is not a negative one. It's almost like death is a chauffeur who picks the speaker up, takes the speaker up, not down, right? So I'm thinking more heaven. And if you look at the conclusion, remember, consider the first words of the poem, consider the last words. That should clue you in to the purpose, just like when you're reading a story or an essay or an article or you're listening to a song. What's the title, the first words, and what are the last words? And they should work together. So right away, because I could not stop for death, right? This idea that we don't get to choose when death, right, picks us up in the carriage and takes us away. Now, again, death is personified, and personification occurs when you give non living things human characteristics, right? Death is described. I mean, think about that whole idea of the Grim Reaper, how death is personified. So, personification is when you give things that aren't human characteristics, right? Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves, and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. You normally wouldn't think that death is slow and careful and civil, right? He sounds like a chauffeur, a positive thing. As the poem goes on, the speaker describes the experience with death in the carriage, right? And in the interest of the conclusion says, since then, 'tis centuries and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were turned toward eternity, right? Eternity and immortality, but no reference to God or religion, ends with a dash, not a period, not a final ending, quote, question mark, right? The annotations in the poem help us to see how the reader was trying to think critically about it, was trying to analyze it, was trying to break it into its parts. So when you're analyzing literature, right, take notes, annotate the poems, annotate the stories, annotate the speeches and the dialogue in Shakespeare so that you can engage with it. And when you have to analyze it, you can think about it from a critical perspective. So, interesting worldview on death, right? Um, one more lecture to go for day 2. Hamlet is coming up shortly. Stay tuned. Until then, thank you for your time and patience.